the golden chains they couldn't break. They came for him on a Tuesday, not with chains, but with smiles and contracts written in languages he'd learned to read but never to trust. His name was Solomon Okafor, and in 1895, he owned more coffee plantations in Brazil than any Portuguese family in São Paulo. His warehouses stretched 3 city blocks. His ships sailed under flags that made European merchants grind their teeth in envy. But you won't find him in any history book. Because by Wednesday, his ships were burning in the harbor. By Thursday, his children were gone. By Friday, the newspapers called it a business dispute. And Solomon Okafor became a ghost. He wasn't alone. 6 other families. Same wealth. Same ending. Same silence that stretches across centuries like a scar that never healed. This is the story they buried so deep, they thought even the earth would forget. History is written by survivors, but edited by cowards. You've been taught a timeline. Slavery, then freedom, then struggle, then civil rights, then progress. A neat little arc that bends toward justice if you squint hard enough and ignore the bodies. What they never taught you is that between 1600 and 1935, black families didn't just survive the machinery of oppression. They hijacked it, rebuilt it, and drove it so far ahead that the people who claimed superiority had to physically destroy the evidence. From African trade kingdoms that held European economies hostage with monopolies on gold and salt, to freed families in the Americas who built banking systems so sophisticated they scared Wall Street before Wall Street even existed. These weren't lucky accidents. These were deliberate architectures of power built by people who understood one fundamental truth. Wealth is memory, and memory is dangerous. So they burned both. Not just the buildings, the bloodlines. Not just the documents, the descendants' ability to even imagine their ancestors were anything other than victims. This wasn't random violence. This was surgical historical amputation. Cut out the success stories. Cauterize the wound with poverty. Teach the children that their grandparents were only ever meant to serve. Because wealthy black families proved something white supremacy couldn't survive. The entire hierarchy was a performance, and they'd learned the choreography. Break time equals 0. 5s/. The Okafor dynasty, when black hands owned the morning. Solomon Okafor arrived in Santos, Brazil, in 1878, with nothing but a shipping clerk's job and a mind that calculated compound interest in his sleep. He was the grandson of an Igbo merchant prince whose kingdom had traded with Portuguese dealers for a century before colonization made that impossible. By 1885, Solomon was free under Brazil's gradual abolition laws. By 1890, he controlled 12 coffee plantations and employed over 400 workers at above-market wages. By 1895, Solomon Okafor owned 37% of all coffee exported from Santos to Europe. Read that again, 37%. If you drank coffee in London in 1895, there was a 1 in 3 chance a black man you'd never heard of decided what you paid for it. His family lived in a mansion overlooking Santos Harbor. His children attended Swiss boarding schools. His wife wore Paris fashions shipped directly from ateliers who knew her name. The Okafor family didn't just beat the system, they owned the scoreboard. And white Brazil watched, seething. On November 12, 1895, Solomon's oldest son, Chukwuma, was found dead in an alley near the docks. Official cause, robbery. But his wallet was still in his pocket, and his Swiss chronometer worth more than most workers earned in a year was still on his wrist. Solomon knew. He hired security. He fortified his estate. He sent his younger children to England. It didn't matter. 3 weeks later, fire erupted simultaneously in 7 of his warehouses. Simultaneously, arson investigators found accelerant traces and coordinated timing. But no one was ever arrested, because the police chief's brother owned competing coffee interests. Solomon tried to rebuild. He had insurance. He had capital. But then the banks stopped extending credit. His insurance company declared the fires an act of business war, not covered under policy. His ships were seized under suddenly discovered tax irregularities. Portuguese coffee barons began visiting his plantations with offers. Sell at 30 cents on the dollar, or watch what happens next. Solomon refused. So they took his children. Not officially. Not legally. Just gone. His 2 youngest daughters vanished from their school in São Paulo. No ransom. No demands. Just silence and the unspoken message, leave or they die. Solomon Okafor, one of the richest men in South America, abandoned everything. He boarded a ship to Liberia with whatever gold he could carry. He never saw his daughters again. He died in Monrovia in 1904, broken by a grief that compounded interest better than any fortune ever could. Brazilian history recorded him as a moderately successful coffee trader who overextended and fled debt. That's the official record. His warehouses? Bought at auction by the families who burned them for fractions of their value. His plantations? Seized and redistributed to legitimate Portuguese agricultural interests. His ships? Scuttled or repainted, histories erased. His grandchildren grew up never knowing their grandfather had been richer than Rockefeller's South American competitors. The erasure was complete. Until now. The Van Doren dynasty, when black bankers broke Manhattan. New York City, 1910. Break time equals 0. 5s/. Elijah Van Doren wasn't born enslaved, his grandfather was, but his father purchased freedom in 1842 and started a modest shipping supply business. Elijah studied economics at Oberlin College, and by 1895, he operated the Northeastern Freedmen's Trust, a private bank serving exclusively black businesses and families. By 1905, his bank held deposits worth $12 million. That's $400 million today. A black-owned bank in Manhattan with nearly $500 million in modern equivalent deposits, lending to black entrepreneurs, black property owners, black professionals. His loan approval rate was higher than white banks' rates because he actually assessed risk properly instead of using skin color as a proxy for creditworthiness. Elijah Van Doren proved something Wall Street couldn't tolerate. Black economic self-sufficiency worked, and it worked better. Then the whispers started. The New York Times ran an editorial in March 1911, The Dangers of Racially Exclusive Banking Practices. It argued that banks serving only one race created economic segregation. A black bank was accused of creating segregation by serving the community that white banks refused to serve. Within months, regulators audited Northeastern Freedmen's Trust. They found nothing, so they changed tactics. In August 1911, after a white bank failed and triggered panic, the Times ran a story claiming Van Doren's bank was vulnerable and customers should secure deposits immediately. It was a lie, a printed, deliberate lie designed to cause a run on his bank. And it worked. Panicked depositors lined up to withdraw everything. Not because the bank was failing, but because a newspaper said it might. Within 72 hours, Northeastern Freedmen's Trust was insolvent. Not because of bad loans. Because the New York Times manufactured a panic and white banks refused emergency credit they'd routinely given white institutions during the same crisis. Elijah Van Doren lost everything. He spent his last years working as a clerk in the industry he'd once mastered. He died in 1923. His obituary was 4 sentences long. It didn't mention he'd once run a $12 million bank. His grandchildren grew up never knowing their family had once threatened Wall Street's racial monopoly. The Times never retracted the story, never apologized. The Van Doren dynasty became a whisper, then a rumor, then nothing. The Ngoma dynasty, when African copper fed European wars. The Kingdom of Kongo, Central Africa. Chief Ngoma III controlled something Europe's war machine desperately needed: copper. High grade, or for cannons, church bells, coins, and brass ship fittings. Ngoma's kingdom mined it, smelted it, and traded it at prices he set. Portuguese, Dutch, British, they all paid, they all negotiated, they all treated Ngoma like the economic power he was. By 1680, Ngoma's family wealth was estimated at 400,000 gold escudos, roughly $200 million today. His capital had stone buildings, paved roads, a judicial system based on written codes, and trade relationships spanning 3 continents. This wasn't a village. This was a state. But Ngoma refused to trade enslaved people in large numbers. He famously told a Portuguese envoy in 1683, "You want copper? I sell copper. You want gold? I sell gold. You want my people? You can go to hell." So Europe did what Europe does when commerce doesn't work: violence disguised as diplomacy. They armed Ngoma's rivals, funded coups, spread smallpox through gift blankets. By 1705, the Kingdom of Kongo was fractured into warring states, all desperate, all willing to trade enslaved people for guns. Ngoma's dynasty was scattered. His mines were seized. His wealth redistributed to Portuguese colonial governors. When European historians wrote about the Kingdom of Kongo, they described it as tribal, primitive, and lacking sophisticated governance. They lied. We have the receipts, trade records, diplomatic letters, tax documents, proof of a functioning state economy. But those records sat in Lisbon archives, untranslated, until the 1970s. By then, generations had been taught that Africa had no history before colonization. Ngoma's descendants live in modern Angola and DRC. Most don't know their ancestor was wealthier than most European nobles. That forgetting was deliberate. Do you see it now? For families, for continents, for centuries. Solomon Okafor, Coffee Empire, burned and stolen. Elijah Van Doren, Banking Empire, destroyed by manufactured panic. Ngoma III, Trade Empire, toppled by funded coups. J.B. Stradford, Real Estate Empire, bombed from airplanes. The pattern isn't coincidence. It's policy. Step 1. Allow black wealth to grow just enough to be visible. Step 2. Use that visibility to justify resentment. Step 3. Destroy the wealth through violence, legal theft, or economic manipulation. Step 4. Erase the evidence so descendants never know what was stolen. Step 5. Teach those descendants they're poor because they didn't try hard enough. Here's the mathematics of generational theft. If Solomon Okafor's 1895 fortune had been passed down with just 3% annual growth, his descendants would control $600 million today. If Elijah Van Doren's bank had survived, his family would be worth $2 billion. If Ngoma's copper wealth had stayed in his family's hands, his descendants would control $50 billion in resource extraction rights. If J.B. Stradford's Tulsa properties had remained with his family, they'd own downtown real estate worth $300 million minimum. Multiply those numbers by the thousands of families this happened to. The total theft is incalculable. Tens of trillions, conservatively. And then they taught you the victims were poor because they were lazy. The inheritance they stole from you. If you're reading this and you're black, understand something. You don't come from poverty. You come from theft. Your ancestors weren't unsuccessful. They were robbed. Somewhere in your bloodline, there's a Solomon, an Elijah, an Ngoma, a JB, someone who built something magnificent, someone who was destroyed for it, someone whose name was scraped off the map so thoroughly you never knew to look for it. But the blood remembers, even when the brain forgets. That's why you dream big, even when the world tells you to stay small. That's why you build even when they say you'll fail. Because somewhere deep in your DNA, there's a memory of mansions and ships and kingdoms and banks. There's a memory of your people being so powerful that empires had to conspire to destroy them. They didn't steal your wealth. They stole your inheritance of belief. They try to make you forget you come from excellence. They failed. What happens next? This isn't ancient history. This is Tuesday. Predatory lending, gentrification, mass incarceration creating free labor. The method changes. The theft continues. But here's what's different now, you know? You know Solomon Okafor existed. You know Elijah Van Doren built a bank that scared Wall Street. You know Ngoma told Europe to go to hell. You know J.B. Stradford's children watched their empire burn. You know the pattern. So now what? You share this. You make it impossible to ignore. You research your own family. You dig into archives. You ask elders questions before they're gone. You demand reparations, not as charity, but as repayment of stolen wealth with compound interest. You build new banks, new businesses, new dynasties. You name them after the ancestors they tried to erase. You teach your children they come from royalty that terrified empires. And when someone asks, why are black communities poor? You don't accept the lie. You say, they're not poor. They're robbed. And I know the names of the thieves. The silence ends with you. The forgetting stops here. For families, this is just 4. There are thousands more buried in archives, waiting for someone to speak their names. Say them. Solomon Okafor, Elijah Van Doren, Ngoma III, J.B. Stradford. Say them until the walls remember. Say them until the thieves' descendants squirm. Say them until every black child knows. You come from kings who own the morning, and they burned the dawn because your light was unbearable. Let them try to erase that. The ledger is open now. And compounding interest is a bitch.